Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Adam Francisco and Bruce Hillman. The Thinking Fellows podcast is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. And don't forget to go to 1517.org just generally, because there are so many resources there each week, including things like Advent Church Resources, which we are doing again in 2024. We did this for the first time in 2023, which is a packet of free resources for churches to use for Advent. They include things like helps for planning Advent services at your church, preaching helps, Bible study helps, anything in there that might help you get through Advent. We know it's a busy time for pastors and churches as they prepare to do extra services. And so we have set this apart for you. You can go to 1517.org. You can see that on the homepage now. You can sign up for those resources, and they will get delivered to you via email. All right, guys. We're doing these great books, I guess, great books and their authors sort of theme of the Christian church. And we're trying to include ones that maybe people haven't read or been exposed to before, or maybe a very slim portion of our audience has done before. And today is Adam's week. We've done 2 episodes leading up to this. So Adam, what are we in for this week?
Well, it's not the Gospel of Thomas like I early proposed.
Yeah, thank you. I read it this week, so that was a waste of time.
I know. I decided to move away from that because I was afraid what Bruce would say. I didn't want to give you too much editorial work, Caleb. But we're going to look at. Did you already mention it?
No, I know.
I was yawning as you were introducing the show. Just got back from deer hunting, so I'm tired. But Eusebius, his ecclesiastical history, written in the early 4th century, probably finished by around 324 A.D.
Bestseller.
Yeah. And indispensable in many ways. It's the first. If Herodotus or Thucydides, most would say Herodotus is the father of like real critical historiography or history writing in the ancient Greco-Roman world, Eusebius would be the father of church history. He gives us the first 300 years of Christianity, fills in lots of gaps. In fact, most of, I don't know what percentage it would be, Bruce probably, or maybe has something to add here, but most of the first 300 years of Christianity we would not know about in terms of how to situate texts that we have and so on, if we didn't have the chronology and the history of Eusebius. So, important figure. Not just a historian, though, was a theologian and an apologist, a exegete. He wrote on any number of topics. There's, I think the collected works of Eusebius is at least 2 massive volumes, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that he wrote that have gone missing. So,
don't you think it's
pretty prolific author?
It's kind of interesting theme of now 3 episodes, and this will probably continue as long as we're in this earlier portion of church history, fathers era of church history, that they couldn't afford to be specialists in just one, quote, field of theology, right? Like when we go and we study theology, we go and specialize in a field. So, I get a degree in systematics. Bruce, I assume systematics?
Yeah, I guess if I had to be in theology, yeah, that's what I would do. And then, you have a degree. I'm in historical theology.
So there's actually good. Then you have historical. Then we have exegetical theology, and it's all separated in, like, you basically, you become a, quote, master of one or whatever. When we talk about these church fathers, Adam just brought it up. It's like, well, he was, he did exegetical work that's highly regarded. He does historical work of the church that's highly regarded, and they're all, like, almost all of them are apologists as well. We talk about certain apologies that they've given, and so there's something about the era, right, where you can't just be good at one portion of theology.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's a real practical thing here too, is this is long before theology is sort of sliced and diced into the university departments or the, I would call it seminary, but what is that, Bruce? Like, that's the age of Schleiermacher in modern theology, where theology becomes increasingly not just specialized, but a critical, I guess, might be the word, where it obsesses over like the fine tuning for most of church history, 1,800 years or maybe a little less. These guys don't.
It's by McCutcheon, and it's called Critics Not Caretakers. And it's a little bit about that history. And it basically says the debate in seminaries in academia today. Like if you go to a seminary that's affiliated with a church body, a lot of times that sees their role as transmitting a tradition. So they're a caretaker. They want to preserve a certain tradition. But McCutcheon argues, in the more kind of secular academic ones, the job of theology is to be a critic, and that this is a real divide in theological studies nowadays. Like, do you want to be a critic or a caretaker? Depending on what journal you write for stuff, the editors are looking for one or the other, and they'll just reject you outright if you're on the other side.
Yeah, most of what we do on this podcast, just for our listeners, when it comes to theology and related topics, is more of the caretaker side, and such that if you jumped onto, I don't even know names, but if you jumped onto podcasts of like these university theological wonks, the conversation is radically different. I think maybe on a popular level, it'd be like, oh, if you want to do something like biblical studies, you want to learn about the Gospels. The caretaker is one who's going to look at the text and the stories and, kind of place himself underneath the text. Then you jump over to like Bart Ehrman's podcast, and it's this manuscript renders this passage this way, and therefore the whole thing is suspect. I mean, this is exaggeration, but
and Adam, maybe if you go there, we can talk about this later. But this actually has real relevance, this debate, to what Eusebius says about apostolic succession.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Do we have to get into that though?
No, I'm saying
I'm afraid what you're going to say about that. Basically, I'm just afraid of you, Bruce.
Well, the very quick thing I was going to say is simply that, the fathers like the idea of a succession of bishops because it preserves a tradition. And even if you're in a church like many of ours that don't adhere to that as an absolute necessity, to have that apostolic succession laying out of hands through an unbroken line, the idea behind it is that the tradition is important, that the job of the theologian isn't to invent new things, and it's to transmit the truth that they've heard in the apostolic faith. But a lot of academic theology today rejects that and says, no, our job is to be like a critic and to invent theology for today.
Yeah, that's how you get published. And if you don't publish, you perish, right?
Yep.
On that note, too, it's interesting even within like a seminary that's an extension of a church body, they will, what's typically done is more of this caretaking type of theology, except when it comes to how they treat other traditions. Then they become critics.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Correct. Yeah.
There's probably a lot we probably ought not go too far down that road, because we're supposed to be talking about Eusebius, not seminary or theological education. So Eusebius, so that's like he's born in around 260 AD. We're not totally sure, but somewhere around there in the Eastern Mediterranean at Caesarea Maritima, right next to the modern sort of resort town in Israel called Caesarea or Caesarea. He's I don't know, rising star is probably too much, but he somewhere along in his, I guess it's probably in his 30s, maybe it was in his 40s, he's becomes pretty influential, such that after the conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity, Eusebius, he doesn't become his right-hand man or anything, but becomes sort of what can we say, like the official sort of propagandist for Constantine, at least when it comes to Constantine as a figure in church history. There's a famous thing I guess, eulogy, oration in praise of Constantine so not a eulogy, that Eusebius wrote, where he treats Constantine and his conversion and his rise to Augustus as something that God had foreordained since ancient times, and it was sort of like a completion of all things on earth. And I don't know if it starts with Eusebius, but you could certainly find the more Eastern Orthodox view of the relationship between church and state, described as Caesaro or Caesaropapism, is articulated by Eusebius. In my mind, I might be forgetting something. It's, I think, the first time. I don't know, Bruce, is that true? You're the patristics guy here.
I don't actually remember. No.
Okay.
No, it's not my head. But he was sort of the like church secretary, essentially, is how I like Nicaea and things like that. Close to Constantine.
Yeah, not uncontroversial either, especially, I mean, even in 21st century, when people think of Eusebius, they're, like in a theological sort of context, they're going to think about and maybe critique him a bit in terms of his moderating position is probably the best construction of it, between the Arians and the Nicene Orthodox Christians in and around the Council of Nicaea. Is it true, Bruce? Maybe, I suspect because it's kind of famous about Eusebius. He's the one who kind of convinces Constantine to be a little more generous to the Arians a little after the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah. And he gets in, he's actually the foe to one of the great Orthodox fathers, Athanasius. And he's really, he gets Athanasius exiled a few times. And Athanasius gets mad, and as he is leaving town, he goes down on a river and he burns down churches. It's not a good time.
Was Athanasius, wasn't he, though he was bishop, wasn't he bishop in exile for?
He went in, if I remember right, 3 or 4 times. He went in and out, and as they were trying to figure things out. Yeah.
Because he just wanted to end that Arian threat swiftly.
Well, it was Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. He's right, everybody else is wrong. And this is not a criticism of Athanasius, just for the record. But
and the nickname was because he came from Africa. His nickname was the Black Dwarf because he was short, and that's what that was kind of what he was known as. And he was a true. He was a force to be reckoned with, just as academically, theologically, and Eusebius knew that. When I think of Eusebius, from my studies, I really think of him as a Christian politician first, and sort of a theologian priest second. I mean, he does most of his work in the court. He's sort of one of the first people where, when Christianity and the state get combined, and you need sort of a Christian secretary, sort of like whatever you would call the guy, I forget the name of the position, the guy who sort of runs the diplomatic end of the Vatican. I forget what they call that position. I always kind of picture Eusebius in sort of that kind of role. His job is to sort of support Constantine and the faith, but not ever to oppose those two things.
Yeah, and so he's got a hard job, right?
Yeah,
but also I think it's that role he plays that causes a lot of even contemporary historians to be a little suspicious of the things he writes. Is it one of the questions? So at Oxford, we had this course in historiography where we're just going through all from Luke forward to Herbert Butterfield, I think is where we ended, but looked at how historians have approached the task of writing history, especially church history. And we had one session, I think it was, forget who it was with, but some esoteric scholar at Christ Church on Eusebius. And one of the points we talked about, not ad nauseum, but at great length, was, can Eusebius be trusted, or is he just simply a propagandist? I think the conclusion was, well, there's stuff in Eusebius where he's clearly writing to prop up Constantine. I always forget how we ought to pronounce his name on this side of the Atlantic, but he's got to support Constantine, but as you said, Bruce, he's also trying to also preserve the true faith. So
I think it's important, people, just for listeners to know too, even with that historical question. And this isn't to justify the areas where he is kind of a true propagandist or is sloppy. And he's really overtly a propagandist when he starts naming names of. That's when you can tell, because he's really overtly like against certain people and for others, and you can just see it clearly in hindsight. But even in times where he doesn't maybe get his facts completely right, as we assume now or found other things out, people didn't do history back then at all like we do history now. It wasn't about necessarily doing like thorough research to try to get every fact straight, nor was it completely sort of a made up thing. The way they did history sort of then was they wanted to essentially support a story that was being told in the present moment, and they wanted to show that that story had historical rootedness, because in the Roman mindset, if something was old, it was true. And this was what allowed for Roman pluralism. So the Romans incredibly gave all these exceptions and dispensations to the Jews to like not worship the emperor and to can maintain their kosher laws, stuff they would never allow in other places. And the reason they justified it was, well, Moses is just as old as our philosophers, so there must be something right in Moses, or it wouldn't have survived this long. And the reason why Christianity was seen originally as bad is it was new, so it can't be true. So history is a sort of political game being played in this time period where you're trying to establish facts about rootedness so that it has legitimacy in the public realm.
Yeah, and how do we moderate that a little bit, Bruce? Because would we want to say, I wouldn't, I don't know about you, but that one should view Eusebius with like critical suspicion. I mean, I do think it's important to have. So I'm going to recommend to our listeners, if you want to read Eusebius' church history, which you should, you'll get a A+ for the day if you do. There's a number of critical editions that will have footnotes that will correct things where Eusebius gets the date wrong, or a commentator will say, yeah, Eusebius is probably exaggerating here because he's got a grudge against this guy. You know, I mean, they won't put it exactly that way, but I think Paul Meyer's translation is probably the most helpful translation in that it is both critical and that he has critical notes at the bottom of the page to correct things or to elucidate things. But he doesn't, like other critical editions, he translates the entirety of Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, but he does so with an eye to making it this wouldn't be his words, but an enjoyable read. Whereas some of these other editions, they keep all the redundancies of Eusebius. Some of the things that, for example, his oration in praise of Constantine is really eloquent. The church history is kind of clunky. And with regard to its reliability, what Paul Meyer does is has all these vignettes and commentaries at the end of each book, or we might call them chapters, long chapters, to explain why Eusebius is doing the things that he does. Speaking to what Bruce just mentioned, but I don't know. I would not want to say Eusebius is merely a sloppy propagandist.
I wouldn't say that either. He's been proven right on many of his points, and he's given us insight that matches, even if it can't be kind of corroborated, it matches with what we know of the ancient world in other contexts. So we go, oh, this maybe was happening in a Christian context because we can corroborate it in, say, a secular context or in something that happened in that area or a tradition that existed in this area that he writes the Christians were doing. Or we have a quote from another church father or someone else who was a contemporary or was earlier that seems to give credence to what Eusebius says. So I always just say with any of the ancient histories, it doesn't matter who you're reading, just don't read them with the same level of accuracy you read a modern day historian, but don't also dismiss them as being dumb and just in this because they're not.
That's what I was looking for.
Know what you're reading into. That's all.
That's. I was wondering, I think that's the best way to take Eusebius. Read it with a critical eye, but also you're reading real history, but with a different intent.
Yeah,
the author has a different intent than, say, the academic historian today who presumes they approach things in a neutral way.
Right.
Ha ha ha. And to add on to your point, Bruce, so I asked you guys, or I told you guys, that we just do book 1 of church history, just to keep the conversation, keep the scope small. 2 points on the desire of Eusebius to look at things in a factual way is in book 1, he spends a great deal of time explaining as he's getting into the life of Christ, and actually doesn't describe the life of Christ in all that great a detail. He's more interested in showing how the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in Christ. But then he does have this fairly lengthy section on reconciling the 2 genealogies of Christ in Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Because there's 2 things here. One is the context. It tells us in the 4th century, there's some scrutiny. There's some people scrutinizing the canonical Gospels or the Gospels, and alleging that there's inaccuracies there because you got 2 genealogies that are a little hard.
They're doing the math on them, and they're like, "This is
So Eusebius does the work, the genealogical work, to explain why it is those genealogies are different. It's not an easy thing and to do, but in short, Matthew is more interested in the legal genealogy, whereas Luke is more interested in the physical or the natural genealogy. But it's a little more complicated than that. And then he also has
Better than saying, "Hey, I got tons of pages on genealogies."
Oh, really? Maybe in Salt Lake City, but
Yeah, I was just gonna say, unless you're Mormon.
he's got another section in book 1 on where he's dealing with he's setting the stage for Jesus' public ministry, and he talks. This isn't very lengthy. It's maybe a half a dozen paragraphs, I guess, where he talks about, he's addressing the question why it is that the gospel accounts suggest there are 2 high priests in Jerusalem at the period of Jesus' trial, because there should only be one. And Eusebius borrows heavily from Josephus, the Jewish historian, and his work, Jewish Antiquities, to explain how when the Gospels mention Caiaphas and Annas, they're actually describing a reality. It corresponds to the reality. Annas was on the way out and Caiaphas was on the way in, but because Annas is the one who's been replaced or who's being replaced by Caiaphas, he's still hanging around,
Mm-hmm.
So Eusebius is very helpful. In book 1, he's very helpful in describing or helping us explain some of those historical difficulties, if you will, found in the gospel accounts. But I want to
add on a ring, just add there. Yeah. That actually shows what you just pointed out. It actually does show, just to our previous comment, he is working with sources, so he's not just making stuff up. So he's not just a pure propagandist. He is doing some of the things that a modern historian would do, just not at the level that a modern historian would.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's almost tedious, because he's got massive block quotes, and he's not trying to fulfill a word count like an undergraduate student by just padding an essay with lots of block quotes. He thinks it's important to preserve these major quotes for posterity, and in fact, we would not be aware of or know about a lot of important figures in church history had it not been for Eusebius copying down word for word, as he puts it, from these sources that have now since gone missing. So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, can we also, just because we are jumping through our time here, so I want to get us into the meat of the book.
Okay. The actual book.
So I want to get us to the meat of the book in this sense, which is that he starts the history here in book 1 by going to the creation and walking through the Old Testament, which is something kind of unique, perhaps in this time. And what you guys are saying, he's patient with the Arians in some senses, where his starting point for Christ and for church history here is something I think we carry on at 1517 very well, which is finding Christ in the Old Testament, right? Like he names Christ as coming from the lips of the prophets. He demonstrates Christ at the foundation of the earth. He does this. So this history starts with finding Christ through the entire pages of the Old Testament, right?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, so book one, just a very, very quick overview. He starts off, the first section is he tells you what he's going to do in the book, and basically says, I'm going to describe all of church history from the time of Christ up until my own day, up until the early 300s. And if you read the whole thing, it's 10 books in length. These aren't long books. Those are basically 10 long chapters. He overlays the chronology with the Roman imperial timeline, through emperors, which is kind of interesting. Not always, sometimes there's overlap. Sometimes he has to go back and so on. But he writes in a way that Thucydides, for example, the old Greek historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, does, where it's not year after year, but he's interested in a straight linear chronological line, and he finds that the Roman emperors are the best way to sort of lay things out and to treat his subjects. But he starts with in book one with Christ, but not Christ born of the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem, but the pre-existent Christ, which is an interesting thing of writing a history. Because, as Bruce said earlier, he is very much interested in, especially in light of the criticism of Roman authors, that Christianity was this novelty, this innovation, in establishing the antiquity of Christianity. This is not Eusebius's words in terms of a heading, but he does have, there's a whole section, it's section 4 that a modern editor has put in there that entitled The Antiquity of the True Faith. And he says, here's a couple things. I know a couple things we can maybe riff off of. He says, all of these credited for righteousness, going back from Abraham to the first man, could be described as Christians in fact, if not in name, without exceeding the truth. Moving forward, clearly then, the recent proclamation of Christ's teaching to all nations, this is after the incarnation, is none other than the very first and most ancient of all religions discovered by Abraham and those lovers of God who followed him. And then one more sentence here. Christians alone across the world practice their faith in the very way that Abraham practiced it. Accordingly, Christ's followers share the same life and religion as the God-loving men of old, and thus Christ's teaching is not new or strange, but, in all honesty, ancient, unique, and true.
Okay,
So, here's an illustration of Bruce's earlier point, not just about the antiquity of the faith, but that Eusebius he's not just, because no historian is neutral. I mean, the goal
but he lays it out
neutral as possible. But he has a point to why he's writing at least the history in book one, and why he's starting with the pre-incarnate Christ promised that existed before there were even humans, because he exists from all eternity with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit.
I got to say,
to your point, Caleb, he's very much interested in showing that while Christ has existed from all eternity, he's been promised since the very foundations of the world, when the first, the proto-evangelion, the first announcement of the gospel is given in Genesis 3, chapter 3, verse 15. That the offspring of the woman would have his heel bitten, but would ultimately crush the head of the serpent.
Yeah, there's
go ahead.
There's like two incredible things here to me with what you just brought up, which is, number one, what an epistemology people had to think that the older something was, the more likely it was true, which is now today, right? Like, only new religions and new ideas are true.
Well, being burdened by the past.
Yeah.
Dear.
Yeah.
So that's a modernist way of thinking, right? Because remember, modernism is anti-tradition.
Yeah.
That's one of the heirlooms of modernism, is that the new and the novel are more
Enlightenment kind of stuff, right?
Reason is this guy, we've discredited all the traditions and can find the truth in reason.
This has gone just haywire today, especially when, there's areas where this is worse today, but ethics probably, in my mind, being one of the most prevalent today of these, is if your ethics are old, they must be outdated, and we've really evolved as a group of people to know this. But the other one really is the identification of Old Testament believers as Christians is I think very strong, right? Because it emphasizes that the faith has always been in the work of Christ. So even in the Old Testament, it's in the coming work of Christ, but God's word as a creative word does what it says. And so that faith is credited to the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets and believers as righteousness too, because it is a creative, completed word, and so they can trust in that.
Yeah, and I think also, as you're on this point about, I mean, I don't know how much time we have, so I don't know how far we should go down this road, because I want to finish book one.
You've got 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, so Eusebius is really helpful here in clearing up, or at least recalling us back to this sort of not just ancient, but pre-modern. Bruce, do you like that term? A pre-modern Christian understanding. I knew you would. I love it too. I just don't like the postmodern word. But that Christianity, alongside the other monotheism, we typically call them the Abrahamic faith today, right? Not we, but others do. It's not that there was like three dispensations of religion that God has revealed, right? As advocates of the Abrahamic faith, sometimes we'll put it that Judaism was around first, and then God decided to do something entirely new and add to this tradition, this Abrahamic tradition, Christianity. And then some would go further and say, eventually, like in the 7th century, God's like, well, I'm going to create a new religion for these people, Islam. Christianity makes no bones, or has in the past, and hopefully still to this day, makes no bones about it, that Christianity is the religion of, as Eusebius puts it, the patriarchs and the prophets. They were Christians in fact, in that they were looking towards a Christ, if not in name.
Yeah, he says
the way one translation puts it.
One of these headings here is that Christianity, here it is, proclaimed by him to all nations, is neither new nor strange, to what you were saying, right? It's not an invented religion. Now, what Christians, especially American Christians, probably need to get a grip on that's kind of offensive is Judaism, apart from Christ, is a new, novel, invented religion.
Certainly, Judaism after 70 AD.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's historically demonstrable. One could argue, I would argue, that extends even long before.
Yeah, that's why I kind of add that apart from Christ moniker, right? Because even here, Eusebius is saying this is a in Christ religion all the way to, to creation. And so it's this apart from Christ is novel.
And I think this is
I'm willing to say it's a separate. I don't want to get in a huge debate here, but I think religions evolve. I mean, they still use the same scriptures. I know what you're saying. The temple's gone. I get that, but there's a group of Judaism that's still waiting for the temple to be rebuilt. Anyway, I just have a different view on that.
Yeah, well, I think Eusebius, and I'm not going to go back to Latin translations. I think do we have the Greek of Eusebius for this work? I'm not for sure.
I've read some of the Greek Eusebius, but I don't know if it's original or someone just put it it was like in the Drew Library. It was like a super old, that old, like great old book.
Yeah. Well, I think at least in the translations, it's very, Eusebius is very careful to talk about the faith of Abraham and to kind of separate that from Judaism, suggesting that maybe in Eusebius's mind, Judaism as a sort of institutional religion, a rabbinic tradition or what have you, is it deviates away from Abraham. Why I find all this stuff interesting is, and this is an aside, but I remember writing a chapter for my dissertation on Luther's argument against Islam on the basis of the antiquity of Christianity, because the Quran makes the parallel claims that Abraham was the first upright Muslim, that the Islamic prophetic lineage goes all the way back to Adam and so on. That makes the claim that Islam is the real, true religion of antiquity, right? And so when Luther encounters that claim in the Quran, when he writes this preface to the Quran, he makes the point that actually Islam is a novelty, Christianity is the original religion. Anyway, so I brought that chapter to my supervisor, who was a austere Sunni Muslim, and he says, this is really interesting stuff. I've never heard Christians argue this way. I said, no, this is like this is the way Christians have historically thought about Christianity, that it was the promise of the Messiah was delivered from the get-go right after the fall and so on. And he goes, well, he put the paper down. He goes, this is back in the day and age when people actually printed out pages instead of digitally, but he puts it down. He goes, well, we Muslims now have a noble theological opponent based on this, which is kind of interesting because this old argument for the antiquity of things isn't relevant for a modernist, or I don't know about a postmodernist, and let's not go down that trail, Bruce, but it is certainly in the context of Islam, and I suspect for those more orthodox leaning or conservative Jews, or the Jews who are hoping that a new temple would be built or something along those lines. Because I think our time is kind of coming to a close. So after Eusebius does all this stuff on the pre-existed Son of God, the messianic prophecies and how they're fulfilled in Christ, he doesn't give us a whole lot on the life of Jesus, filling in the gray area left behind the Gospels. That is to say, there's not really anything that I recall on Eusebius concerning Jesus before his public ministry, except for his birth, and that's where you get Eusebius making sense of the different genealogies. But then where things get really interesting is like towards the end of book one, where in the one place where he does recount something from Jesus' early life, though it's not really dealing with Jesus so much, is he gives us a fairly lengthy description of the slaughter of the innocents. When Herod, the so-called great, issues the order that all children under the age of, was it 2, be executed, and Joseph takes Jesus down to Egypt. He has all these juicy quotes from Josephus about how all that happened, and then the punishment Herod gets from God for doing that. Where he gets into excruciating detail, such that he describes the worms that were crawling inside Herod's rotting body and so on. And he does it from a couple different sources too, to show that this isn't just Josephus, but these are other authors who were describing these historical events. It's that, if you're into that sort of, I read it to my 12-year-old son. He's like, his stomach's turning, but he's like, this is awesome. So anyway, so it's not just a boring church history. There's all sorts of sensational stories.
By the way, Adam, that also points out that, because like modern historians, non-religious historians, secular historians, pretty much deny that historical event happened, the slaughter of the innocents. But I remember being taught in college by a secular professor how for decades they said David didn't exist. There was no evidence for King David. And then, like in the middle of the desert, they found a stele, that listed with his name for David. And then they're like, oh, I guess a lot of this stuff is true. So when you read Eusebius, we continue throughout the centuries to also be surprised as corroborating evidence appears in the sands, and you go, oh wait, maybe that did happen.
I love how is some inscription is better proof than like a centuries old document with narrative and passed down history. That's always funny to me that like rocks are better evidence than like the recordings of humans. But
so, something similar happened with Pontius Pilate. Nobody really doubted the existence of Pontius Pilate, but they thought, I think it's Luke who describes him as the prefect of Judea. Like, see, Luke got his title wrong, right? Because and I think it's Tacitus or Suetonius that describes Pilate as proconsul, right? Quibbling over these sorts of things. And so the critique was like, well, maybe the Gospels have some historical things, but they get lots of things wrong, like the title of Pontius Pilate. And then I think it was the 70s. I want to say 79. It may have been 1969. And
they found a tablet, right?
His hometown. They found a stone inscribed on it, a sort of dedication to a stadium to Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, showing that, interestingly, the gospel accounts had it more correct or more accurate than the official imperial historian of Rome. So,
well, actually, just yesterday, I just looked it up because I remember reading it yesterday on the news. They've had this Babylonian clay tablet that they found years ago. But they couldn't translate it, and they finally found some way to translate it, and they just announced the news yesterday. It's the oldest map in the world. This tablet contains the oldest known map
Huh.
in existence. And it is a map to the location of Noah's Ark. And it is a Babylonian tablet
Are you
that's
serious?
1,000 years old. And people used to go, if you wanted to go see the Ark, here was a map to show you how to go see it.
Bro, Thinking Fellows field trip.
Yeah, do it.
We got to.
And it talks about, Ararat, and that's actually how they translated it. The guy who was able to finally translate was able to recognize Ararat or some derivative of it.
Is it
That's what I read.
the same Ararat today? Like, is it?
Nah, that's what the debate is, because they referred to it as regions of Ararat back then too, so they don't actually know if it meant like that mountain or that area. But it's 3,000 years old.
That's incredible.
You know how at like national parks, they're like really worried that things will disappear because people take like a piece or whatever. Yeah. At this point, it's just like enough people went and visited the Ark from this map that pieces just disappeared, one group at it.
It's pretty cool if you just, readers want in their own time, just go look up a picture of it. It's like a sun map and it's all carved and then there's all little things.
Hey, I want to, before our time runs, do we still have a couple minutes?
You got a couple minutes, yeah.
One last interesting story in book 1 as it gets to a brief description of the life of Jesus. Then it starts introducing the story of the disciples of Jesus, and the whole second chapter is going to be on the apostles. But he leaves us with this little story towards the end about he's talking about, so there were 12 apostles, but then there were 70 disciples, and he makes this point there were more than 70, but 70 is what's called the Gospels, and he goes, we don't know the names of all of them, but he starts naming some of them. Then he talks about the disciple named Thaddeus, and he recounts this fascinating story, which is not, here's an example of Eusebius being a little perhaps gullible, how a king of the Armenian city of Edessa, was it Abgar the Fifth, sent a letter to Jesus. He sent in using a courier, asking Jesus or telling Jesus, "Hey, I've heard that you perform miracles. He's got some sort of disease. Would you come up here and heal me?" And Jesus allegedly writes a letter back and says to him, I'll read it real quick. Abgar Ukama the Tapark, blessed are you who believed in me without seeing me, for it is written that those who have seen me will not believe in me, and that those who have not seen me will believe and live. Now, regarding your request that I come to you, I must first complete all that I was sent here to do. And once that is completed, must be taken up to the one who sent me. When I have been taken up, I will send one of my disciples to heal your suffering and bring life to you and yours. And Eusebius makes the point. He says that he went up to Edessa and found in their, what's the place where you keep records? Why can't I think of this?
The library?
Not the library, but there's a more, the formal sort of
Clerk's office?
Oh gosh,
The forum?
No.
Anyway, I don't know.
Oh boy, I wish I would have underlined it. But he says he went into the archives. Thank you, in Edessa, and found the actual letters in Syriac. He translated them out of Syriac into Greek, and here they are. And you go, what? I've never heard this about Jesus receiving a letter and a convoy from Edessa. Well, the Armenians didn't convert until about the middle of the 2nd century. So what it seems to be is like a very embellished story that for sure, at least Paul Meyer makes a point, for sure there was something in the archives up in Edessa in the early 4th century that Eusebius found and translated. But Eusebius wasn't critical enough, because he's not a modern historian, and he perhaps wants this to be true, believe that this was recounting something that happened in the 3rd decade or in Jesus' public ministry, when in fact it's rather a story that was that went through some legendary accretions are added to it that retells the story of the conversion of the Armenians about 150 years later, 120 years later, but situates it in a different context. But it's this guy, this disciple Thaddeus, that eventually goes up to Armenia and converts Abgar. I think it's the 7th in the 2nd century. So anyway, there are lots of little stories like that in Eusebius's church history. That's the last story he'll tell in book 1, where these historical curiosities that some of them are true, can be confirmed. Some of them seem a little suspect. Eusebius is not just so gullible where he's going to include anything that is sort of promotes whatever it is he's trying to persuade his readers of. Eusebius can be critical of sources. He mentions in book 1 a spurious source called Acts of Pilate, which is this. I guess there are several different Acts of Pilate. That is like a historical records of what happened under Pontius Pilate's prefectship. But Eusebius makes the point that these things are all forgeries. He also talks about what we typically call today non-canonical gospels, and makes the point that there's a reason why they're not read in the churches, and because they're not, they're forgeries or pseudepigrapha, and so on. So a great book, worth your time. I recommend Paul Meyer's translation for its readability, but also it's the insight he gives. Paul Meyer is like no other, and the images, like in the text are pictures of archaeological finds and footnotes and commentaries that are not burdensome, but actually, you literally could sit down and probably read this book, and I don't know, it'd probably take several hours, but it would be one of these books where it's like not the sort of boring church history, but kind of exciting because you hear about all these stories you never heard about up until about when he finishes the book in 324 AD. So,
well, cool.
There you have it.
Yeah, the format's pretty readable too, as you said, Adam, right? It's broken up into a lot of smaller parts and stories and subheadings. So it's one of those ones where you don't have to sit and read page after page after page after page. You can digest a little bit and come back to it.
Yeah.
So very good.
Bruce would want you to read the Greek, but and that would be great, but the English translation is great.
Well, fun. A good pick. Thank you, Adam. I wouldn't have come to mind myself, so I appreciate that. For listeners of this show, I will put a link to that translation that Adam suggested in the show notes below. You can also find links to other things going on at 1517. As I mentioned before, there are links to the Advent resources for church that's quickly coming upon us. And so if you are looking for some help there, definitely look at that. There are also new books from the publishing house right now. We have Broken Bonds, a novel of the Reformation by Amy Montravati. It's a very interesting concept. It deals with the relationships at play when Luther is writing The Bondage of the Will. It's a fiction. It's a novel. It takes the real history and then it sort of dramatizes it and makes it very interesting and fun, and adds some depth to the personalities like Luther, Erasmus, Melanchthon, and those things that are going on there. So definitely check that out. We will catch you next time. Bye.